Welcome back to Chris and Retro. Today's video is definitely something that's important to me. My longtime friend Brian Yates is joining the show, and we did a previous work called 100 Proof Living, where we talked about a conversation between a cop and a criminal. And I wasn't the cop, Brian was, but our point of that conversation was to say that we all are kind of walking this journey together. We have a lot of the same challenges, a lot of same struggles, regardless of what uniform we have on or position in life. So that work was important to both of us. We've both gone on to other things. Brian's history, he's a war fighter and a veteran, law enforcement veteran. He's currently into private security work and has done that for quite a while. He's a former professor and CEO of 100 Proof Living, which is work that we did together, as well as some other ventures that he's been working on. He's an international man of mystery, so to speak, and a friend of mine and somebody that I really believe in. And welcome to the show, Brian.
Thanks, buddy. It's great to do something like this with you again, and I appreciate your passion for this, and I can't wait for the discussion.
Yeah. Since I've known Brian, this has been probably at least the first two or three times that we met, this conversation came up, and it's been something that's been nagging on him. And I can tell you that any testament that he has to this subject that we're going to talk about today is very personal. This isn't something he's just speaking of because he's done some of the work. I know for a fact for this man that this is very personal to him, and I want to make sure that we connect the dots between what we understand to be true and creating an environment where others want to come and come out of the darkness, so to speak. I'll start with some stats. We're going to speak about the challenges for veterans population and first responders related to mental health and some of the struggles they face. Some stats that I pulled up just to framing this up is, the American Warrior Partnership said in 2020, 16.8 vets die per day of suicide. In the 18 to 64 range, it's 22 to 24 per day. So in this tighter range, that it's almost 24 people a day die of suicide. American Addiction Centers said that in 2001 to 2020, the prevalence of substance abuse disorder and mental health rose from 27.9% to almost 42%. That's a huge rise, and that's all in the first responder population. The National Institute of Health said that in 2022, 14.3% of 100,000 first responders committed suicide. Not attempted, not thought about it, committed suicide. And the ambulance workers, they said, were at an elevated rate beyond that. And the last stat I'll give you, this comes from a division under the Health and Human Services Division. It's called SAMHSA. I've referenced their information before relative to mental health issues with kids. They state that 30% of first responders develop behavioral health conditions versus 20% of the rest of the population. 10% higher rate of behavioral health issues exist with our first responders. And nothing's being said about this. So, Brian, what's the secret?
Man, that's a lot. I want to be careful here because I understand that this is, I hope this reaches an audience that this is very sensitive to. And so, I approach this with a little bit of fear and, like you said, a ton of passion, because you say, what's the secret? There's no magic wand, but there are a lot of secrets, right? I mean, I talk about taking the cape off. That's something that I talk about a lot in circles, kind of inside the blue line, and in veteran circles, people that have served and are now out. And there's a mental health component to this. There is a kind of a isolation component to this, which then also plays back into mental health, and it just keeps getting worse. And so I don't know exactly how to unpack this best, but to me, the reason, my impression of the reason that these rates continue to climb is partially because first responders can't ever take the cape off. So let me give you kind of how I feel about that. And I actually have a great example this week from a very young friend that just got into law enforcement. So whether you're a firefighter, a paramedic, police officer, or somebody else that has to run toward the things that most people don't want to be a part of, be it danger, be it trauma, you go into there for various reasons. Sometimes it's to make a good living. Sometimes it's because you really want to help or serve people. Sometimes it's because you're on a power trip. Sometimes people, a lot of different reasons you go into it. But during your training process, you begin to be exposed to that community. So once you swear in, or once you take your oath, or once you sign your employment paperwork, you kind of cross the line. And when you do that, you begin to be molded by those people around you. And where I see the danger is on day one. So just as an example, for almost, I think every first responder position, they do a psychological background, right? And they assess your mental health, just like they do a physical. They check your physical capabilities, but then they also do blood work in a traditional kind of annual physical. We redo those physicals every year for your health benefits or for whatever reason. If you get injured, you have to go in and make sure you're fit for duty.
Mm-hmm.
We don't do that psychologically. And
I was wondering about that. If you've got a baseline assessment to see if they're competent, but when they're probably in the most stress possible after they start the job,
well, right,
reevaluate them.
and it's a standard of fitness for duty. So if you have to do so many push-ups and pull-ups, the military makes you redo that every year. Some police departments make you do that on a regular basis. But certainly, you have to be fit for duty if you have an injury. Well, we're not even determining if people are having psychological injuries, and we're known now because of these symptoms that they are. But just to kind of focus on that, can't take the cape off. When you enter into that community, for example, let me just try to use some kind of innocuous examples, but you have to have kind of a specific personality type. You have to be able to stomach some of the things that you see in trauma and in violent circumstances. And so when you enter in as a young cadet or a young firefighter, the first time you get actual exposure to it outside the classroom, outside the academy, you're actually out on the street and you have to see something. Mm-hmm. Whatever your natural instinct is, to turn away or to jump in or to throw up or whatever that instinct might be, that response is immediately molded by people around you. There's a callousness, there's a laughter that goes on, there's a sarcasm that goes on. That's how people tend to deal with it. And so early on as a young person, you're made to feel like you're really not supposed to have kind of a guttural reaction to this. You're not supposed to be sick to your stomach. You're not supposed to be fearful. And so that's part of that community. And let's be honest, you can't be. If I've been in a terrible car wreck and the paramedic shows up and gets sick to their stomach because they don't like what they're looking at, that doesn't comfort the patient. If you run into a bar fight and you don't want to get hurt, or you don't have the constitution to jump in and take control of that, you're not helping the people involved in that situation. So this is all very necessary, and that's the putting the cape on.
I think there's a story that reminds me of actually where you're really unprepared for that first event. Nobody guarantees that your first call isn't going to be something traumatic either. Mm-hmm. My friend Carlton, who dreamed of being in law enforcement, had some challenges getting into it. He worked in the Rochester City Police, and his very first call was a child homicide. And he had a young child at home, and that was his very first call alone. He'd been riding along, I guess, but his very first call alone was that one, and it was a pretty prominent case locally. Nobody's going to prepare him for that, so I can see what you're saying. The conditioned responses now started to be the investment they made into him and how he would deal with that in the future.
So, and I want to be careful when we're having this conversation. I want to be really clear on two things. Mm-hmm. Thank God for people like him.
Yeah, for sure.
Right? Thank God for first responders that are willing to go out there and do things that most people can't. And at the same time, where is the support? I just read an article about the Dallas Police Department. They've started investing more in the mental health and the well-being of their officers. Mm-hmm. And they've actually seen an improvement in de-escalation of circumstances. So you think of the, officers go into something and, we don't want them to overreact and we want them to de-escalate the circumstance. But if you're going in there and you're not fit for duty emotionally or mentally, and we don't know which ones are and which ones aren't because we're not doing that regular assessment, then we're letting them down. And I don't want to get tied up into the police abuses and those types of things. No. But at the end of the day, I'm not convinced it's law enforcement letting the community down. I'm more convinced that it's the system letting law enforcement down, not being properly trained, not being properly equipped, and not being properly supported. But and this kind of ties back into that taking the cape off. Let me give you an example. Um, I go to a traumatic event, fatal car accident, a shooting, something, and maybe the end of my shift, I'm doing my paperwork and trying to tie all that up. And, a supervisor might come up and say, okay, based on the dynamics of this event, we need to kind of check in and see how you're doing.
Mhm.
Now, the option is I can say, you know what, that was awful. And I need some time I can't believe what I just saw. I think that's a very human response, even for the heroes,
Right.
even for the people that are willing to go do that job. I think, but if I do that, I'm going to be removed from duty. And all of the other people that were on that call with me, they have the same choice. They can say, I need some time. Or what 99% of us do is say, I'm good.
Yeah.
And
So it's almost penalized if you actually come clean and say, I need the support, which I find interesting because when you talk about that Dallas scenario or any other scenario where the support systems come in, I don't care who you are as a human being, it's not within you to deal with something that happened to you. You would need to have support and those around you. You have to, there's two parts to it. It has to be available to you and you have to be willing to accept it. And it sounds like the framework for the current state is that if you are willing to accept it, it's still penalized based on the system. And if you aren't willing to accept it, then you're never really going to get ahead of it.
yeah, no, I think that's right. And I don't think it's, I don't think officers or firefighters or medics or other people in that scenario, I don't think they're sitting around, wishing ill on other people. I
Right.
think it's a matter of survival. And if five of us are in a circumstance where we're all going to get kind of gut checked to see how we're doing after a particular call,
Mhm.
especially when it involves children, because I think even heartless people uh,
Yeah.
get torn up over kids, right?
Well,
So
kids are the heartstrings, whether you're in prison or in the cop. It doesn't matter what you are.
absolutely,
The kids create a brand new band of information
yeah,
and feelings.
yeah, absolutely. And so if there's five of us in a situation, and I know they're going to ask all of us the same questions, I know that if I say, hey, you know what, I need a minute, I need a couple days, put me on light duty, or let me go talk to a doc and just clear my head a little bit. I know
Mhm.
that if I do that, I'm adding weight to the other four. And
Oh,
so,
gotcha.
what if all five of us say, you know what, that was horrific, and we need a couple days? Who's
That
going to
makes
work?
sense.
Who's going to work the street the next day?
That makes sense to me because I mean, if you look at recruiting being so far down too, you've got that burden as
Oh my
well. So there's other factors in it. So that if you are out, most departments are already short staffed as it is, and so now, so I can understand why that would be a challenge. Especially, one of the elements that you pointed out to me over the years too is the camaraderie. You're not gonna if you're a team player brings a lot of you'll go through a lot to make sure your team's okay too. So I can understand that pressure being there as well. You know, how do you how do you even deal with that? It sounds to me like there's a lot of factors around that that aren't really they're outside of your control. Like, let's just say that you were a very willing person to make sure that you stay healthy and mentally capable to do your job appropriately. What would somebody even do in that situation?
Well, honestly, it takes really good leadership. So I think the departments where you see better performance, you're seeing leaders that will openly say, take your health day, take a PTO, take a sick day. Um, they do more collaborative things like, let's have debriefings as a group and let's talk about what we saw and what we felt and not and again, that'll get knocked for being touchy feely, but it's, when I went through the police academy, and I was already probably 40 years old when I went through the police academy because I had done other work before. But we had a psychologist tell us that after a 10-hour, relatively busy shift for first responders,
Hmm.
it takes 72 hours to physiologically decompress from that.
Okay. I,
You don't get 3 days off after
no,
one day of work.
right.
You work usually 4 10s or 5 8s, and then you're pulling overtime, and it just builds up and it builds up and it builds up. And if you're not doing self care in a way that mitigates some of that, you need to have people around you that are doing that collectively. And so that's why I say, really good leadership is important because you need a chief, you need a captain, you need in the ER, you need a doc, you need a floor charge nurse to be able to say, you know what, I'm going to take tomorrow off, and here's why. I I had a
Yeah.
really rough week, and I need to do this, and I will be back on such and such a day, so long as I'm fit for duty. If you had a leader say that, you're way more inclined to follow suit,
Right.
because if it's okay for the boss to do it, it's okay for me to do it. But I think that, in all areas of first responders, there's this sense of, when I come in at 18, 19, 20, 21 years old, there's this old school.
Yeah.
They had it harder. They're a little more gristly and hardened, and
Mhm.
I don't want to let them down, and I don't want to get ridiculed, and so we have to do something to break that cycle.
Yeah, I think about Brian, let's think about our stories, you and I, okay?
Mhm.
And you're taking into account being a law enforcement officer under that kind of stress, and now you would need 72 hours to recover from that 8-hour shift, right? Is that what, did I understand that correlation correctly?
Yep.
Okay, so you need the 72 hours, and you are legitimately in what we would define as a mental health issue that over time compounds to some of these staggering statistics.
Mhm.
So now let's take Brian Yates, an officer who didn't get his 72 hours to decompress from a car accident that killed a kid or something like that, and then mental health alcoholic Chris, who's absolutely being a complete nightmare on the street, and we intersect.
Mhm.
That we're both in crisis. I have a different version of it, and I might be completely out of control because I'm not really co-signing any rules or anything in my life right now because I'm in a massive crisis. You're still in a kind of a traumatic situation on your own side of things, and then it collides. And that's
Right.
you and I. And it's because, and I think in that case, for personalities like you and I, and one of the reasons why we get along so well is we are kind of go forward and go at them guys. So now we're both fighting through. I'm fighting through the best I know how, and you happen to be one of my fights. You're fighting through the best you know how, and I happen to be another pain in the neck that you got to deal with on this shift. And so I think that's where we get some of these collisions. And I am also being careful with it because I don't really take a side in this situation. I'm just saying that that is the true dynamic of two human beings in two different roles colliding, and these things can happen. So for the law enforcement side of it, I do think that there's got to be some way, and I know that you've been troubled with this for a lot of years, is how do we crack the code? How does it become, as your words, be a voice and give permission to come across that line? How do we do this?
So, a couple of things. I do go back to strong leadership, and I think strong leadership would kind of incorporate this part two, which would be the regular assessments. And so giving permission to take the cape off. There's a lot of different things that you can do. So my daughter is a nurse in the ER, and within that, there are different roles. Sometimes she's up in triage. Sometimes she's working beds. Sometimes she's doing other things. There's no reason that a police officer, and same thing if you say at the fire department, there's different roles on the truck, different roles within the station. Um, there's no reason that police officers have to go grind it out on the street every single day,
Mhm.
right? There are other jobs, and typically what happens is, there's an opening in training, so you go into training, and then you're just in the parking lot there until you get fired, or maybe they have a limited time there. But there's no reason that people can't just constantly rotate through, so that on my non-duty hours, when I have other work to do, that can be the decompression. And maybe there could be some mental assessments that go on those kind of maybe light duty days or whatever it
Mhm.
is. But that'll never happen in today's day and age. I mean, most of these major metros are down hundreds of officers,
Hmm.
and we can all kind of decide in our own minds how we got there. It doesn't matter. Right now, the statistics are alarming at what you just read in the beginning of this conversation, and all first responder. I think fire right now is actually kind of thriving, but medical and police are down really, really bad. And so you're compounding, you're putting more pressure on that because there's less opportunity to take time off. So I think good leadership and more focus on mental health, which would be more routine assessments, way more than once a year,
Mhm.
and some type of variance in how much you're exposed to that. If you're in a little podunk town that really doesn't see that much, okay, maybe and you won't have the staffing to do it. But in these major metros, anytime you have more than a few officers on duty, there should be a rotation, a rotation through the department much more often, so that people are not constantly put in those same dynamic situations.
That makes a lot of sense to me. The other thing too is, we talk a lot about inclusion in the world that we're in right now, but we
Mm.
don't create an environment of treatment and behavioral health work that brings all those communities together, including law enforcement. We're always bringing programs to law enforcement to fix them, or bringing programs to help those, struggling with substance use and mental health issues to fix them. But we don't allow everybody to be part of that community that's just trying to work better together with the exact same issue functioning in their bodies. I think this morning we just had a situation here in Canandaigua where an Ontario County deputy had to shoot an individual, I think it was 7 or 8 times here after a high speed chase. And that deputy, we don't face a lot of that in this city. It just doesn't happen. Once every 5 years, you might have a shooting. And now are the resources around? I don't think you made the delineation between a small town and a big city. If the baseline is that we're all just one community with a similar situation, it doesn't matter if you're a small town or big city, because there's treatment programs in all of them. If
Oh, for
across
sure.
the board you're just Brian the cop and I'm just Chris the criminal, it doesn't really matter. We're still striving to function better as human beings, recognizing the same elements exist. And the first one is accepting that we are that. We're not superhuman in any capacity.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I just think there's such a difference between call volume. Like, there
Yep.
are there are departments that you can work all across the country where you may not get a call. It might have to be all proactive policing. So
Yeah.
you're not exposed to the trauma all day long. Whereas you work in a major metro and you're running hot call to hot call. I mean, we're not even responding to shoplifting and minor
Yeah.
crimes anymore. It's just, if you have an issue, take it to the police department and fill out a statement, but we don't have the officers to do it. So they're just
Yeah.
running violent crime after violent crime. And so I think there can be a different, but yeah, I mean,
That makes sense.
it's this idea of, well, that's the job that you signed up for. Well, again, to the isolation part. So let me give you 2 examples. This young guy that I spoke of earlier has only been in law enforcement a year,
Mhm.
and he's now questioning maybe he should do something else.
Gotcha.
And I would suggest, because he doesn't have that support system. Now, quietly, I'm hoping that he gets out, because I don't. He's in early enough into the deliberation of, man, I've seen some horrible stuff, and I don't know if I can take this. Now, if he could get a sabbatical for a week or a few days to go process this with a professional and figure out, like, are you equipped to deal with this? And some people aren't. It's just like some people's physical structure, over time, when you build up strength, you can squat 500 pounds. There's a lot of people that will never do that. Bad knees, bad back. It's the same thing psychologically. Some people have the constitution to deal with those things, but it does take a workout. It's not just throw them into the fire. And so this young guy has been thrown into the fire, and he's deciding whether or not he should stay in the field. And he's just not given the support that he needs. But
Mhm.
he's sharp enough to be questioning it and to be talking to some of us other vets that, hey, I don't know if I should stick with this or not.
Let me let
Go
me
ahead.
ask you a question about that. So when you were in his shoes, did you anticipate or have the feelings or the emotions already in you or let me rephrase that. When you first went into law enforcement, did you have any understanding of what you would actually see and face, or in the military for that matter?
No,
I mean,
and I think that's part of, in a lot of things when you're young in life, is you're
Mhm.
bulletproof. And so,
Right.
yeah, of course I'm going to go to car wrecks, and of course I'm going to go to this, and of course I'm going to see this, and you just don't sit and analyze it and think about it. It
Right.
just happens. And when it does, when you're young, you are conditioned by those around you. If someone had pulled me aside after the first fatality and been like, "Hey, this sucks,
Mhm.
and you're going to see a lot of this. So here's what we do after we see something like this: we cry it out, or we yell it out, or we go to a prayer group, or we go to a support group, and we should be doing this once a month together just to talk about what we're seeing." There is
Right.
just so little of that goes on. And I know there are some progressive departments out there that are doing more of that, and I'm grateful for that, because the people on the front line deserve it.
The reason I asked that, it was somewhat leading. I apologize, but I was leading you a little bit. Is I think that addresses the cop out of saying you chose to do the job. No pun intended. That statement of you chose the job is, yes, you chose the job, but it's also like saying you chose to be an addict. If I believe that that actually is a disease and there's issues related to that, I can't say I chose that, but I also can't say that all the things that we should just suck it up as if you're a law enforcement officer, you didn't choose everything that you would see, smell, hear at a major traumatic event, all the senses. I would imagine, I'm just imagining it because haven't been in your shoes. I know some of the things that you've described to me, and for my audience, Brian is no joke. I mean, the stuff Brian has faced from our conversations is pretty ugly, and most people wouldn't be sitting here with a smile on their face, dressed well, and well, everybody would be smiling in Arizona from my perception. But I mean, the thing is that Brian has seen all this, so he's coming from a position of authority. But the thing is that to say that it's a job you chose, that it's different than everybody else, I would say that's not true. You chose a job, but didn't necessarily choose all of those senses being violated, so to speak, and multiple times, especially if you start talking about the volume that they face. How could you not become numb to that? It's no different than how could you not become numb if you're on the street seeing multiple assaults over and over again. I haven't seen a lot in my life. I've lived a lot of bad decisions, but I haven't seen a lot. But I can tell you I'm numb to many things that I wasn't numb to before. And it comes from exposure. And I think in many ways that's unhealthy. Has it caused me to commit additional crime and to have a rampant addiction in my life again or any of those things? No, but there were some crossroads that all came from investment of other people, including people like Brian. He invested in my life and helped me become somebody stronger that I could go then live a life that I want to live. But it doesn't happen alone. And I consider myself a fairly strong person. So I want to touch on that, Brian, just real quick, because as we start to close this out, just for this brief discussion on the subject, but, you've come a long way. Your childhood, as you've just proclaimed on other shows, was no cup of tea. Your military experience was no walk in the park. Your law enforcement experience has ups and downs and craziness all the way through it. How did you land here? Who invested in you, and how do you invest in others today?
So my personal answer is that's a God thing. I think, I have, as I look back now, I can look and see God's hand in my life and the way he put people around me. So kind of like surrogate fathers as a kid through coaches and teachers and whatever, and their impact on me. And then as I moved into my career, I can still see the faces of supervisors young in my career. And then even as I aged out through my career, just having those people that were willing to look me in the eye and sometimes have difficult conversations, but also have encouraging conversations. I think sometimes we expect so much of our younger workforce, and I'm not about kid gloves at all, but I'm a realist, and I think that you can be honest and you can tell people when they need to buck up, but you can also tell people that it is hard and that you understand their struggle and they need to get through it. And you'll help them through it, right? It's like a coach helping someone get through a tough workout. And so for me, it's absolutely it's God using formative people in my life, and I hope then to turn and be a formative person for others. A good piece of advice that I would give: if you have a circle of people that you're in, and everyone's constantly looking to you for your stories and your answers and your advice and your counsel. If you're the ringleader of that, then you need to get some more friends, because you need people that are doing that for you. No matter how strong you are, no matter how advanced you are, no matter if you have the highest income or the highest intellect, you need people around you that can put their arm around you when you need it, and that are willing, even with your strong personality, to kick you in the butt when you need it.
For sure, that accountability.
Absolutely. And so just one thing I really want to touch on before we go is kind of that isolation part. So
Sure.
I believe that the statistics have gotten out of control, both on the job and especially in retirement, because you isolate. When I was on the job, we had a guy in our department in the basement. Someone walked in on him and he had a gun in his mouth. And he had gotten to that point for various reasons. And as soon as that happened, he was a pariah. Everybody looked at him differently. He's the weak one. You know what? If after his first bad event, if after, whether it's marital issues because of stress on the job or it's the stress on the job, if that had been mitigated early on, I think he would have built up a stronger constitution to be able to deal with some of those things, or he could have exited from the career field earlier based on more frequent assessments. And then also the veteran from first responders, especially that my heart goes out to the veterans in the military that when they spend 20, 30 years doing something and they have a great ceremony and a send off, and then they go home and they sit at their house and they're lost. When
Mhm.
I walk into it, when I'm on the job and I wear a badge at work, every time I walk into a room full of officers, we don't have to talk about anything specific, but there's a commonality. That's why they call it the thin blue line, because we're all on the same side of that line. When you're a veteran, you know people have been through basic training and had the snot bubbles from the CS gas room, and you had to do your low crawling and your push-ups, and you just have that commonality. When you retire and you walk away from that, you lose that and you isolate, and you
Right.
don't feel like anybody in the room understands you. And I would say the same can be said for people in recovery, that once they've left that community and now they're in recovery, sometimes they feel isolated because that friend group is gone, that group at work is gone, whatever it is. Isolation is such a massive problem.
Yeah.
And with the division in our country and in our world, that isolation keeps getting worse. And I think that could be one area that we attack, even in our immediate circles, if not on a broader scale.
I would 100% agree with that. I mean, isolation for me is a fertile breeding ground for reoccurrence. If I'm isolating, and I choose to isolate because it becomes, the world around me becomes something I just don't want to deal with. People are aggravating me. I'm going to go away from that. And then what am I left to? My own counsel in my own head. And as you're describing in law enforcement, you are probably facing things now that you really just didn't have time to think about. If I hear the pace that you're talking about, that's a pretty active, action-packed movie. I don't have a lot of
Right.
time to be watching
Right.
anything else while that's going on. Now all of a sudden the movie in my head is all that I'm hearing and playing 24/7, and I'm alone. And I probably are now having to face damaged relationships, regrets, guilt, all that other stuff. And so I can understand why that would be a big thing. And it probably speaks to a lot of the challenges that are out there. Brian, I've said this, I can't say this enough. I mean, I appreciate the authenticity that you've had around this subject. I know a lot of people jump on bandwagons. This is something that absolutely, in quiet conversations and who you actually are as a man, matters to you. And so what I'm hoping is this conversation starts to at least scratch the surface of some awareness where we can use it, and anything that we can use outside of it. Is there anything that you want to leave the audience with today?
Yeah, I would just say, if somebody hears this and you're a first responder, or you were a first responder, you're serving in the military, or you're a veteran, or that population of people that is related to those people,
Hmm.
I would say this is real. It's not going away. There's all these organizations that talk about 22 a day, and that's like the culmination and the worst of it. There are thousands, if not millions, of people suffering with levels of depression, levels of mental injuries from the work that they've done and from the divisions that we have. And they are isolating because there doesn't seem to be this capacity to offload in a way that doesn't make you look weak. And so I would say, you know, love on each other. I think God created us for community, and I can't go it alone. And I've learned I don't want to go it alone. There have been times when I tried and did pretty well for a while, but when you start to burn out and you've been all alone for so long, there's nobody around you to help you, and you really start to slow down. And so, for the veterans and for the first responders, it's okay. It's okay to tell someone. And if you know what, if it's too hard at your department because of the stigma and because of the culture that's there, go to an online psychologist. Do something. Take a step toward taking care of yourself so that you don't end up completely alone with what looks like no other options in your life. So I'm grateful for your leadership in this and bringing this again to the forefront. And there's a lot of people out there that would be willing to look them in the eye and just say, you know what, it's okay. And the options are, you can keep going down this path, just bearing more weight and more weight and more weight. And 6 months from now, you can kind of realize what that's going to look like.
Mhm.
Or you can start the process of spending the next 6 months trying to get to a healthier, better place. And at the
Agreed.
end of the day, if that meant changing jobs, changing careers, and getting healthy and happy and having some joy and fulfillment in life, which seems to be absent now, I would say it would be well worth it.
Man, I would agree with that. It's powerful stuff, Brian, honestly. And I think it's hard for me not to make the correlation between recovery,
Mhm.
because the things you're describing is one move. There's always one more move to make. And it doesn't always have to be taking yourself out of here. There's worse things than death and incarceration for the addict. It's incapacitation is worse, in a lot of ways. But in your life, in your current situation, you think about all the reasons why you're not exposing things, because maybe you might think that love is defined in some certain way that seems soft. Sometimes just one move is all you have to take. You think about fighters to putting their toe on the line. It's the first shot they land. It's taking the center of the ring. It's these types of things. There are very aggressive steps that you can take to make you understand that you're moving forward, not because you're weak, but because you're taking a stand. You've decided it's more than you want to. You will. And you've decided that you will take your life back and have it be something that matters to you. And that's something that can happen for any single person watching this thing. And I truly believe it. I've seen it in Brian's life, who's been a dear friend to me. And I've seen it as God has manifested himself in my life and shown me a clear path of what I need to do. I think that for anybody watching this, it can be your story as well. Appreciate you guys tuning into this episode. I hope it was meaningful to you, and please share it as much as you possibly can. Like and subscribe. We want to make sure we get the word out. Between now and the next time we talk, make sure you're making progress with these things. There's things that you've been isolating and pushing aside. So please make progress, even if it's just one move today. It doesn't have to be the whole story. You're not going to get 6 months in one day, but you could make the first move. It's very possible you could do it as you're watching this video now. So please make that move. Keep making progress, and please stay out of trouble. Thanks.